Hola, ¿cómo están? ¿Sí? ¿Cómo están? Es lunes, pero ¿tienen energía? ¿Sí? Bueno, bienvenidos. Welcome, everybody. How's everyone feeling? You feeling good? I kept saying that this was the best Monday ever, so I don't really like Mondays, but this has been a great Monday. So, welcome, everybody. We're really excited to be here. Today has been, honestly, a great day. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight for this wonderful coming together of the USC Trojan family. My name is Billy Vela. I was a first-generation college student, grew up in Highland Park, and parents immigrated to the United States from Guatemala, Central America. I attended Occidental College, got my BA there, and Teachers College, Columbia University, for a master's degree in higher education. I've been in the field of student affairs for 20 years now, and the past 10 years serving as a director of El Centro Chicano here in the Division of Student Affairs since 2005. In October of 2015, El Centro Chicano received great news. We, the oldest ethnic-specific cultural center at USC, established in 1972, were asked to take part in Dr. Pedro Valdes-Sosa's historic visit to USC. We were honored and excited for this opportunity and what it would mean for the USC Latino community, as well as the overall Trojan family. Specifically, we were asked to take the lead in Dr. Valdes-Sosa's university-wide lecture. We knew it would take a village, so we asked for partners. So we wanted to thank you all of our 17 co-sponsors that you see on that. Yeah, let's give that a round of applause. I would also like to thank and acknowledge at this time a few special folks, including Dr. Ainsley Carey, Vice President of Student Affairs, and my supervisor, Dr. Lynette Merriman, Assistant Vice Provost for Student Affairs, Support and Advocacy. Please wave, Lynette. Thank you both for your leadership and your support. Also, thank you to Jack Van Horn, Associate Professor of Neurology in the USC Mark and Mary Stevens Neuroimaging and Informatic Institute. That's a lot to say right there. As we were partnered together for this exciting adventure. Jack, where are you? There he is. Let me give him another round of applause. Thank you, Jack. Finally, thank you to El Centro Chicano's Office Manager, Leticia Delgado, as well as our student staff. Can I hear the applause? They played a huge role in today and this visit. Now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Provost Michael Quick, who will be introducing our inaugural Latino Last Lecture Series featuring Dr. Pedro Valdes-Sosa. Dr. Michael Quick received his PhD in neuroscience from Emory University. He was appointed Provost on April 1st, 2015. He also serves as Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and as Professor of Biological Sciences in the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. As the university's second-ranking administrator, he oversees the USC Dornsife College as well as USC's Keck School of Medicine and 17 other professional schools. In addition to the Division of Student Affairs, libraries, information technology services, research, student religious life, and enrollment services. His strategic priorities for the university include tackling the quote-unquote wicked problems, confronting the 21st century, faculty and student access and opportunity, educational value and affordability, and global impact. Let's give a warm round of applause for USC Provost Michael Quick.
Oh, thank you so much. It is great to see everyone here. And as usual in classes, everyone sits at the back. That's great. Really did a great job of introducing most of the folks who need to be recognized, but he forgot one person, and that's Billy Vela himself. He is just amazing at El Centro Chicano. Thank you for everything you do. Just wonderful. So this is really an exciting evening, I think, for a lot of us. For me, for a number of different reasons. One, I'm a neuroscientist by training, and those of you who are in the field of neuroscience know that, in fact, one of the strongest areas and some of the greatest directions that the field has moved in over the last 50 years has been work that's been coming out of Cuba. And in talking to our guest today, it really struck me. He's exactly right that, you know, when one thinks about how much progress has been made in neuroscience and through the contributions of Cuban neuroscientists under, you know, what everyone would say are difficult conditions at best in terms of communication and those kinds of things, to think what we will now accomplish with those sort of barriers down and our ability now to be able to integrate much more closely, I think the sky's the limit. I completely agree that we have tremendous opportunities in our own field and in many other fields for seeing that happen. And I know a lot of the discussions we had, and I'm so excited by this, are what are the opportunities in the field of neuroscience, and then and broadening that to create great relationships between the University of Southern California and our colleagues in Cuba. I think there are just so many opportunities for faculty exchanges, for student exchanges at every level, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate students. What can we do, work on together that actually changes the world in amazing ways? And so I'm so excited for neuroscience in that regard, that we have so many opportunities going forward. I'm also excited because much of the work that our guest has done in his career really resonates with the direction I see a lot of the work that this university does so well beyond neuroscience. It's this idea that it's not just about basic science, it's how basic science informs health and how we advance as a community. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'd like to see our university do more of, which is what impacts can all of our research have on the world? And so it's been great to have those conversations as well. We have so much to learn. It's so interesting to think that Cuba has a tremendous educational program, sort of the level of education, the level of health in Cuba. We have so much to learn. I'm so interested in understanding how we can partner to better educate ourselves about what we can do in this country to make opportunities for everyone. So I think there's so much going on there. I was also intrigued, it's still up there, I was also intrigued with this whole idea that you guys came up with for the last lecture series. It kind of freaked me out, actually, when I read it. I just thought, what would I say if this were my last lecture that I might possibly give? Oh, that would be an angry, long list of people I would call now. But I don't think that's what's going to happen this evening, because our guest is so much more mature than I am.
We can arrange the next one.
No, you don't want to get me started, dude. You really do not. But it also is kind of scary, because to think that, I hate to think that this is anything but a practice for any last lecture that one might give. But it's a really neat idea to think about, what would one want to say for 20 minutes to really talk about both one's past, one's future, how one sees the world, and I think that's just a really neat idea. So I congratulate all of you who had a hand in thinking about how we might have this broad lecture series. I only had a chance to spend 20 minutes or so this morning with our visitor, and I was just so struck. One, with his Midwestern accent, he comes from Chicago, but more so about just the way he sees the world. And I think anything that we can do that expands that worldview for all of us, I think is a great thing, and it's wonderful that I get a chance to talk to someone who really has, in his own way and in his own field, and that's my field as well, neuroscience, really change the way science operates, the idea behind how we can record electrical signals in brain to tell something about how people are, whether it's their state of health or their state of mind. He really is a leader in all that. But he's also a big thinker about the world, our role in it, and I'm really looking forward to his talk this evening. So please, without further ado, you didn't come to hear a provost, you came to hear the one and only, please, Dr. Pedro Valdes-Sosa.
So I have to say I'm pretty intimidated by all these introductions. Okay, so first I want to thank Jack for initiating this whole thing, Billy for exploiting me so much today and really organizing things, and Provost Quick for the welcome I've received in the interesting discussions we've had. I am going to give a personal description of the journey I've made to the work I've done. It's not so outstanding. It's just, I think, interesting. So let's start, and let me see how I move this. Okay, so I was asked to give a very short last lecture, okay? I hope I can keep to the time that I was given. So you have to understand why I have this Miss Western accent, and it is basically because my parents, there they are, they went to the States from Cuba. My father was a medical doctor, my mother was an English teacher. In the late 40s, they moved to the US for political and economic reasons. This led to a development which was the fact that those two kids were born twins. So you see there Pedro, my twin brother Mitchell, is actually the co-director of the Cuban Neuroscience Center. And the question marks there are because not even our mother can distinguish who's who in these early photographs. Okay? So I was born at the Norwegian American Hospital, and I actually grew up in Chicago till I was 11. Here you see on the left, we used to live at Elmwood Park. I visited this place about 5 years ago, for the first time in 50 years. And our parents transmitted to us two passions. One was a passion for science. I'm showing you the place we used to visit every other weekend, which was the Chicago Museum of Natural History. And I'm showing a book that I really read without understanding at 12, but then reread at, at 10, I'm sorry, and reread at 12, which was The Origin of Species. So these things were lying around the house. An additional thing that my parents transmitted to us was a sense of social commitment. And I remember very clearly one time we crossed in a ferry to Cuba. That ferry trip is now being reestablished after having been absent for nearly half a century. Now, one of the things that happened on that trip was that my parents took me to visit a shanty town and to meet with Afro-Americans. And there were two main lessons that came from that. They told me that some people are unfortunate to be discriminated due to their race or their lack of wealth. And the other message is that more important than money is helping other people. So these two things were messages that were being transmitted consistently. My father, since the 40s, started collecting Scientific American. It was a bit different from now. It was the time of Gerald Peel and Dennis Flanagan, where top scientists united with tremendous science editors to construct stories that were really, and this was one that attracted my attention when I was about 10. So I read it 10 years after. It was by a guy called Ray Walter. It's called An Imitation of Life, and it starts in the dark ages before the invention of the electronic vacuum tube. Now, the interesting thing is that this guy was proposing, he was an electrophysiologist, a neurophysiologist, and he was proposing to try to create objects that had life-like characteristics from electronics. And at that time, this is what I thought, I'm going to do this. I want to do something that has to do with electronics, mathematics, trying to model the mind. So this was actually some of the things that started marking me. In 1959 was the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Many things started happening after that. Well, there was a national campaign against illiteracy, which wiped out illiteracy in 1 year. Here we see one of the young people that went into the countryside to teach people to read and write. We see Maria Luisa, my wife. Maria Luisa's down there in the first. And we didn't meet at that time, but she was part of this literacy campaign. My family returned to Cuba precisely in this year. So I was catching up and speaking Spanish. I spoke Spanish, but I started reading Jules Verne to actually learn to transmit what I had learned in English to Spanish. Our Academy of Sciences, which was created a few years before the US Academy of Sciences, was reactivated. Several research institutes for medicine were created. The first large research center was created. This is the National Center for Scientific Research. You see the building. This was 1965, as recent as that. Now, the medical school was renovated, and we started receiving several people from Latin America. And this was another lesson, which was solidarity from other people from Latin America. So we have Ruth and Bjorn Holmgren. They were Chilean. The then Senator Salvador Allende asked them if they would want to help reconstruct and construct science in Cuba. We have Alberto Granados down here, and many of you may have known him from his participation in the trip around Latin America with Che Guevara, the Motorcycle Diaries. And he was a biochemist, and he was another of the people that founded our group. Dr. Talia Harmony, who was my mentor, and she's from Mexico. So you see, we started out our lab by having a Latino community come and create, and this happened in all the disciplines. Now, these people had a very high social consciousness, and they had a series of principles that they tried to put forward, and it was that in our countries, Latin America and developing countries, the national science agenda should transform our countries. It isn't a question just about using knowledge, about having knowledge, it's about transforming society. Second, that applied research is much more difficult than basic research, and in fact leads to basic research. Third, that PhDs are not the result, should be the result of the agenda and not an end of itself. Additionally, it's a mistake to send students abroad when they are not identified with the research agenda, and at last, that collaboration is essential, and science is not an individual endeavor. So these were the things that they had in mind. What was the field we picked for research? It was to do the analysis of the electrical activity of the brain. I'm not going to get into technical details. I want to explain briefly what this is. You put electrodes on the scalp. This is actually a device developed by my center. You record the voltage differences, and these traces, which are known as the EEG, and also when you process this and get that part of the EEG that's related to an external stimulus, this is what's known as an evoked potential recording. So these were the things we wanted to work with. My other mentor came in at that time. This is Erwin Roy John. He's an amazing scientist from the US. He went as a volunteer underage and fought in the Battle of the Bulge and through the Second World War. When he came back at the University of Chicago, he did physics and then a PhD in psychology. He was a giant, and he was also a person who really believed in helping other people. So in 1969, he made a collection with scientists from New York, and they donated this piece of equipment you see here, which is known as a computer of average transits. And it has a plaque that says, "To the Cuban people from their North American friends." And this actually kicked off research. And so I'm telling you, Cuba and the US so long apart, But our history, and everybody knows this in Cuba, has been always tied to joint developments. This message of actually transcending political differences, to have research and to try to apply it, is something that I think also was an early part of all our education of my whole generation. So he was asked by the Cuban government whether it would be possible to get some computers to continue this analysis we were looking at. And of course then he found out that the embargo was in place. So a group of engineers was asked, can you guys design a computer? And they did what normally scientists do. I mean, if there's a problem, they worked on it, and a year later, that's the first Cuban microcomputer. That's actually my mentor, and this is me when I was 19, and I'm reading a tape, because at that time, the information was so little that you could actually read the tapes. And this grand machine for us had the amount of memory of 4K memory. So you can imagine what you had to do to be able to do analysis. Now, this stimulated. So the agenda was to use computers, look at the electrical activity of the brain, and see if we could diagnose and help the treatment of people, and that this could be an instrument to be deployed in developing countries everywhere. It was a grand dream. I remember that the Vice Minister of Health at that time came to tell us to forget it. Very kindly, he was a nice person, because computers were never going to be used in medicine. And of course, we didn't pay attention, which was a good thing. Anyway, this led me to actually study a lot of math at that time. These are some of the books I looked through. My first publication, which was classified, what you see there, I'm not going to bore you with the technical details, was using the computer to see if there was groupings of waveforms that were similar across people and what were the subgroups. And this I did on the Cuban computer. So the work developed, it was always in collaboration with New York University and other friends. And in fact, we actually published in Science in 1977 an article. We called it neurometrics, and the idea was that you could use electrical brain activity of the brain, electrical brain activity, to try to analyze it statistically and do diagnosis. So this was a landmark paper. I continue working on this. I continue working, for example, and I'm not going to go into the details. If you have an EEG recording, you use mathematical models. This is from my latest paper, to look at what parts of the brain are producing this superficial activity. So we're trying to drill into the brain, and from the superficial activity, find out which areas are active. My training was then further enhanced by a postdoc at Brain Research Labs at NYU. I'm showing you there the Apple computer, because my mentor and me, we were walking down the street, we look at this store, and they're selling this computer. And we said, this is what we need for EEG recording. And then I remember that most people said, that's a toy. But then my task as a postdoc was to program that to be a monitor for brain coma. And in fact, it was used at NYU at Bellevue for 5 years afterward, and it worked perfectly. But this sort of stimulated further developments, and we later constructed, and this is the initial team in Cuba, that large clunky thing was pretty advanced for its time. It was an EEG system with a Cuban computer, and this is what we started to spread out in Cuba to try to create a national network for different types of diagnosis. All of this was closely related, once again, to work with the US. We had an incredible workshop in 1989. Many of the giants of US science were there, in psychology, Carl Pribram, Roy John, Stephen Hilliard. These were people who were landmark people in neuroscience and in cognitive neuroscience. We published the book called Machinery of the Mind, and there you see with Roy John, okay, Mitchell and Pedro again, but without the question marks. You know, I let myself have a beard so it wouldn't be so difficult to distinguish. Okay, what's evolved from this? Well, CNERO, or the Cuban Neuroscience Center, we work with a closed-loop strategy. You have to understand, we come from a country that has very little resources, and what evolved, since we didn't have the opportunity of having, let's say, academic research go on in one place and then have industry as a backup, what we did was to start creating institutions in the 80s that had the full cycle from research and development to go on to production, to then actually we started spinning it off and exporting it, and that gave input to the economy, substantial input, and then permitted us to create a network of laboratories all over the country. Now, this is actually a model that has worked for several different areas. For example, in Cuba, we screened since the 80s all children for prenatal defects. In Cuba, of the 13 vaccines that people received, 11 are produced nationally. So this is a model that might be useful for other countries that are developing, which is the majority of the world, by the way. And it brought a vision of how we should do neuroscience research. So a basic question is, there's a lot of money being put into the neurosciences. How will that impact what's known as the global burden of disease? And the global burden of disease is a measure of how much different brain disorders are causing either shortening of life or life that's not lived to the full. And this was invented by the World Bank and then taken up by WHO. But the big question is, okay, we put in a lot of books worldwide to do neuroscience. Has it really changed the way brain disorders affect people across the world? And the answer definitely is not as much as we would like. And part of the problem is that we have, on the one hand, research in neuroscience. Down here, we have the global burden of disease. There's something called neurotechnology for diagnosis and treatment, and the translational research is converting that neurotechnology into precisely something that has a medical impact. But up to now, the way things run worldwide, which is driven, so the research part is usually funded publicly. This part, many times, is driven only by profit, and what happens is that it's left at the highest level of health. If you want to impact on the global burden of disease, you have to move this down. So some of this translational research and neurotechnology reaches primary health care. And this was precisely what we did. We have developed, for example, techniques to detect children that have hearing problems. And this is done by giving them sound to the ear, stimulating the bone. This reaches the internal ear, the cochlea. We can then mathematically separate which tones for each ear at which intensities, and we can, in about 25 minutes, create what's known as an audiogram, which is a diagram of what is the hearing at different sound frequencies, at different pitches of the child. Now, this can be done for children that are unconscious, newborns, and in fact, what we did in the 80s was to establish a national program for screening for hearing loss. Now, this has had a measurable impact. We downstream, I mean, it's been since the 80s, it's been time, we've been able to check, doing population-wide studies, what has been the impact of this program. And it's been significant. 5 years, for example, of development of language, which has been accelerated in these kids compared to those that weren't detected. Now, we have always believed that in correspondence with the help that we received at the beginning from other Latin American countries, that we should give back. And several of these programs which we have developed and which I will not describe in more detail has been extended to other countries. For example, we have helped the government of Ecuador to carry out neurodevelopmental screening. These are the magnitude of the effort, where of course it's been Ecuador who's done it, but with our technology and our advice. And frankly, we think this closes the cycle. We received help and we're giving it back. I really have to mention of my personal life that Maria Luisa, who's here, She came actually to consult me more than 30 years ago about factor analysis, which is a mathematical technique, and we started working together since we've been working together. Here you see our latest paper last year, and it's been trying to use electrophysiological techniques to gauge the effect of rehabilitation of very severely damaged children. So this is all left to the creation of the Cuban Neuroscience Center. This is our venue. This is our new venue. Here you can see that we occupy a very large area. We have an MRI building, neurochemistry. This here is a primate facility. Here is a teaching facility. It has new equipment. So here you can see the MRI that was donated to us by the University of Maastricht, and which was part of the inauguration of the new system. It's a 3 Tesla system, a high field system. We also have production facilities. So for example, now we are producing the hearing aids for the whole country. So a kit, from the different provinces, they send us in a mold of the child's ear. We scan it, here it is in the computer. We do 3D printing, we fit in the electronics, we send it back. So this is part of the idea that the same center does basic research, scouts out problems to be solved, puts them into production, and participates with the Ministry of Health or Education in solving these problems. Now, I have to say that we continue to have support. This was the inauguration of our new facilities. Jack was there, as was Mark Cohen and many other scientists. This was the first time. This was at the end of 2014 that we had 2 heads of department from the National Institutes of Mental Health come to Cuba. And this was followed very closely by Obama and Raul Castro announcing the reestablishment of U.S.-Cuba diplomatic relations. Now, Obama mentions, and his announcement of the reestablishment of relations, he mentions the name of Carlo J. Finlay. This name is very closely associated to the U.S. scientist Jesse Lazier. This has been followed by a number of efforts on the scientific community. For example, on the left, you see the, let's say this is a paper that came out. It's a political point of view of the need to establish relations between Cuba and the U.S. and the neurosciences. This other here is a report on Cuban science, published in Science. And this was a meeting held last December with the AAAS, the Society of Neurosciences, and the whole point was to start exchanges now that it is allowed. A bit the message is the following, and already the provost said it. If we were able to do so much before, when there were substantial political barriers and opposition, now that the doors are opening, what more can we do? A lot. And what more we can do can be not only of benefit to both our countries, it can actually be of benefit to other countries. I wish to sort of end with 2 things. One is to let you know that at the end of August, we're having another international meeting, and you're all welcome to participate. We just had another one which was very significant. It was the launching of the Global Brain Health Institute last December. We see here Bruce Miller from UCSF. This is Ian Robertson from Trinity College in Dublin. And this is Shekhar Saxena. He's the Director of Mental Health of the World Health Organization. What we're committed here and everywhere we're establishing relations is to think of doing good science, but then trying to make that science have an impact in global health. I wish to end my presentation with what we have written here. This presides all our activities in our auditorium, and it's this phrase from the national apostle Jose Marti. He said, "To persist in the sterile, when you can do the useful, to deal with the easy when you have the mettle to attempt the difficult, is to strip talent of its dignity." And he said this in New York in 1884. So This is my story. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you again, Dr. Pedro Valdes-Sosa. Now what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna do a Q&A. So I have some students that are bringing a few chairs to set us up over here. And luckily for me, I have a great friend over here that's gonna be assisting me in co-moderating that Q&A. But before we go there, again, it's not a very easy task to tell someone to put their life's work into 20 minutes. So can we please give it up again to Dr. Pedro Valdes-Sosa? It's been a real pleasure getting to know him today. He's obviously extremely passionate about the work he does, as is his wife, Maria Luisa. And I was telling them, you know, how amazing it is that they've been together for 34 years. Let's give it up for that. And they're extremely passionate people, and I know here at USC that we have a lot of extremely passionate people. I myself see myself as that, but it's great to see so many other people, and it's always nice to meet another individual, in this case a team, that works together. So with that said, if you guys could bring the chairs right over here, right in front of the microphones. I'm gonna go ahead and ask El Profe to sit down. Maria Luisa, actually, many of the students asked me if we can have both of the team sit together. Is that a good idea? So, yeah, a 2-for-1 here. So we'd love to be able to hear from you as well. What I'd like to do now is introduce my co-moderator, who is Professor Roberto Suro. He holds a joint appointment as a professor in Annenberg School for Communication Journalism and the School of Policy Planning and Development at USC. He's also the director of the Tomas Rivera Policy Institute, an interdisciplinary university research center exploring the challenges and opportunities of demographic diversity in the 21st century global city. Professor Suro also holds 2 major service positions outside the university. I think they're pretty cool. As a member of the board of directors of Independent Sector, the nation's largest associations of philanthropies and charities, and as a trustee of the Haynes Foundation, a leading supporter of social science research here in LA. Finally, and this is important, sorry man, you got a lot of great stuff. Prior to joining the faculty, he was the director of the Pew Hispanic Center. So let's please give it up for Professor Suro. Thank you and acknowledge Dean Andrew Grossmont, the new Dean at the Gould Law School and first Latino Dean. So please, thank you so much for being with us.
So I'd like to pick up where you left off with Marti. And this notion of leaving the sterile for the useful. You started your talking about the idea of Cuban science moving with an agenda and with purpose. I'd like to ask you both to talk about the process that leads you from the sterile to the useful. How do you, when you're talking about something as abstract as mathematics, something that can be quite, you could sterilize it very readily, you know, and live entirely in a world apart from the useful. How do you bridge these two things? What is the process? What is the conversation among colleagues like when you're dealing with something as abstract as the mathematics of the brain, and your ambition is to be transformative?
Well, this depends on creating a research environment where there's exchange of ideas. So, for example, and it also depends on the training of the people. So before studying mathematics, I was sent off to, I was the medical doctor for a town which I had to cross with a raft. And I served for several months as the general practitioner there. So I think that you have to have a lot of different experiences and also have a group that, and all of these things marked us. So first we had the intention of, the role model that was set up was to try to be useful. And I think this is important that people should know. If what is only guiding people is vanity or getting a reputation in any field and not actually thinking of how you could serve society, well, that leads to the sterile. But if you also don't create an environment where there's exchange of idea, then there's no way to bridge it. I think one of the successes we had was to have people from different points of view that went from the social, the psychology, the math, the physics, the engineering, meet together with a common purpose. So what we wanted to be is be useful, and each of us brought something to that. And it was quite an interesting experience, actually.
So when you're doing science, how do you bring the non-scientists in the conversation in order to formulate that agenda?
Okay, this we have experience in, and it is by attempting to learn how to communicate, which is very difficult, and with many mistakes along the way. But for example, I have to say that the people of Cuba have been a participant of everything we've done. We've explained it to them, and we've learned that you have to take the time. People are really more intelligent than some scientists think they are. You just have to take the trouble to, and really many scientific and mathematical ideas are quite simple. We've just learned to say them in complicated ways. So you have to translate in your mind things so that everybody can understand it, and then take the trouble and explain it to people. And the results are amazing, let me tell you. Here at UCLA, I've heard, our Toga told me while I was still there, that they would get in studies for brain mapping an enrollment of about 10% of people paying them something. We get an enrollment of 90% of the people for nothing, because we just explain this is going to be useful. So they say, okay, give me a brain scan so I can put it in my living room, and then we do that. And they just know, because we are continuously communicating science. I have to say that I was really shocked. I grew up when the first Sputnik in Chicago. And at that time, the science teachers were the heroes and everything. When I came back to do my postdoc at NYU, things had changed. The public perception of science, for some reason, it was not the same. And I think that we scientists sometimes are at fault for this. We have the burden of explaining to everybody what we're doing and convincing them that this is for good. So I think it takes a lot of effort and thought.
How does that translate into the way the scientists are trained? I mean, you've both have helped to produce generations of other scientists. I'm thinking about in this audience, what are the conversations like with young scientists in order to create this kind of this sort of vocation, which is very different than the sterile scientist?
Okay, so it's not a question of conversation only. It's a question of doing things together. So what we do, for example, I participate with my students both in, let's say, the more abstract stuff. We can sit down and talk equations and write a paper, but we also then participate in some practical thing, because there's no amount of things you can tell people until you do it with them. They're not going to actually, it's not going to sink in, really. Can you? Nothing.
And actually, excuse me, I wanted to jump in. So actually, is it possible, Maria Luisa, can you introduce yourself and a little bit about your work and your background? That would be wonderful for the audience.
Sorry. My background is psychologist. I finished my psychology bachelor in University of Havana in 1974. In 91, I did my dissertation for my PhD in event-related potential in face recognition, familiarity recognition in faces. And my last 20 years was working at the head of neuropsychology department at the International Center for Neurological Rehabilitation in Havana. My specialization is in rehabilitation for neurological disorders. This is my intention, my motivation is to rehab people with disorders, neurological disorders, psychiatric disorders, especially children with cerebral palsy or aging, pathological aging. Research in new wearable devices, tablets, electronics technology to rehabilitation. It could be cognitive process, memory, attention, concentration, and my main field is to evaluate the before and after the intervention, how the neuroplasticity in the brain is working. Using EEG, event-related potential, using EEG or whatever we have, fMRI. And this is the collaboration we have in China, in Cuba, with Mexico, with Alia Harmony in Querétaro. We are looking for neurofeedback, for new procedures on how to do the intervention more easy for patients, and how to do the evaluation of the plasticity in the brain.
And I just wanted to mention that we were going to do a few more questions, and then we're going to pass it on to the audience. So please prepare some questions. I know you have some, but just wanted to give you that heads up that in a few minutes we'll do that.
So, one of the interesting benefits of living in a revolutionary state has been the ability to work in that closed loop you described, where you go from basic research to production to treatment, and you cover the entire circuit from pure science to public health and medicine. Much more difficult to do in a capitalist society like ours, where you have an industry between the scientists and the delivery of medical care. I'm sure you've considered now that we've had 14 months since the announcement of the opening. How does that difference how do we negotiate that difference in systems? How are we going to forge cooperation given that the relationship between science and medicine, between science and public health, is so different in these two countries?
It's going to take a lot of intelligence and a lot of work. But I think there's increasing awareness, at least I've seen it in the press, that there's some things that simply can't be solved. Be it far from me to have a blueprint or suggestions for anybody's other society, okay? But there's certain things that cannot be left to be spontaneous. We have alerts now due to Ebola, to Zika. And these things are things that if there had been some investment in these very low profit things, can avoid major dangers. I think that there has to be a sea change in the attitude towards this sort of thing that's really better sponsored by philanthropies or other types of, or government funding, and not driven so much by a private profit, because there isn't much profit. I can tell you one story that has to do with Cuba. It was the epidemic of meningitis B in Africa. It was decimating Africa. And then WHO was looking for a vaccine, and it couldn't get any of the companies interested, because I've spoken to the executives, the CEOs of these companies, and they say there's not enough profit margin. So at the end, it was a Latino alliance that solved the problem. WHO ended up, Cuba made the vaccines, Brazil would package it, and this was is being shipped to Africa. Now, the thing is that there's certain things where the best people to involve in are those that are affected. The third world is affected. This is not something that is a major concern. However, it would do for, let's say, the more developed countries, the US in particular, that has the greatest scientific potential, to think about having a more global, let's say, impact. And it may have to do then with looking for mechanisms that are not entirely driven by profit, and that take into considerations the needs of the greater part of, there's this big divide between how much, 80% of the money is a usual thing, it may be different, is only benefiting, the money for biomedical research is to benefit only the 20% of the population of the world. I think it's worse. So something has to be done about this, and one of the first things is having people talk about it and start thinking about it. I think we have to be very creative. In fact, I think that this approach to solving. I had an interview on CNN with Sanjay Gupta, and he prepared a trick question, and he asked me, okay, explain, and I'm going to ask you, to the American public, how come Cuba and the US have approximately the same health statistics with an order of magnitude less expenditure in health? And of course, there's an evident answer. We have to be concerned about prevention and primary health care. And this cannot be subject to profit or gain, because this is a human right that has to be defended at all costs. And now that I hope that the animosity is drifting away, we can learn from each other. I mean, we've always considered that we can learn from the States. Maybe there's something that the States can learn from Cuba.
One last question before we go to the audience. So, say you were invited to give a last lecture 20 years from now. Another 20 years of work. Or 10 years. 15 years. What's the next thing you want to do? What's the next, if you, between now and your next last lecture, what is it you hope to be able to say you did?
Well, first, before I say that, I would ask for 3 times more time to be able to talk.
So 60 years.
We'll negotiate.
But no, what I would like to talk about is actually seeing some of these transformations occur in the world. I would really like to see if we've advanced. I'm organizing with the World Health Organization and the Organization for Human Brain Mapping a full-day symposium in Geneva, the 1st of July, and it's going to be about this. How can we transform neuroscience and brain mapping in particular into affecting global health and the global burden of disease? I think that a lot of the effort that I have to put in the next few years is actually making science less sterile.
Excellent.
All right. So with that, we're gonna open it up to the crowd. I see a hand already. So good stuff. Wish I could throw this over there, but instead I'll just use my team over here.
Buenas noches, me llamo José Ricardo. Primeramente, gracias por estar aquí. My name is Richard, and my work is around, it's in social work, and using dance as a form of suicide prevention with gay and lesbian youth, looking at proprioceptors and body dysmorphia. What do you think are the opportunities for neuroscience and the arts to come together, specifically dance, and this idea of body mapping and proprioceptors? Bueno, también lo puedo hacer en español. Bueno, mi trabajo es originalmente de cómo usar danza de una manera de trabajar con estudiantes que son gay y lesbianos y tratar de prevenir el suicidio, mirando el cuerpo y cómo comentar sobre el uso de la danza y en las ciencias.
Bueno, es que yo no nací en Chicago, por eso me cuesta mucho trabajo.
No, está bien, aquí somos bilingües.
Bueno, ustedes son latinos. Existen en el cerebro determinados centros que tienen que ver con la recompensa, con las emociones, y eso las neurociencias cognitivas y las neurociencias afectivas han desarrollado muchos modelos de cómo por vía del neurofeedback, por vía de la estimulación afectiva, lograr esa estimulación en esas áreas y lograr que las personas logren controlar sin medicamentos la depresión, la ansiedad y otros trastornos psiquiátricos. Yo pienso que este tipo de población no debe diferenciarse porque tengan una orientación sexual determinada, sino por presentar un déficit emocional, porque puede ser una persona con una orientación sexual determinada sin depresión. Es la depresión el target que habría que atender. Entonces, el arte, sea la música, que nosotros demostramos en este estudio de musicoterapia en niños con afecciones neurológicas, va directa a centros determinados del cerebro que provocan placer. Y ese placer se irradia a otras áreas del cerebro y permite que el estado emocional cambie positivamente. Y se utilizan sistemas de neurofeedback, donde tú, utilizando otro estímulo, la música puede ser el puente, o pueden ser caras con distintos niveles de emociones, de acuerdo al tipo de experimento o de intervención terapéutica que estás haciendo, se puede provocar en el cerebro ese estado de felicidad, de éxtasis que tienen las personas, solo con estímulos naturales, pueden ser artísticos de distintas manifestaciones. Yo pienso que eso, la ciencia, las neurociencias se enfocan hacia ese objetivo. Y es fácil de lograr, porque ya hay toda una evidencia de cómo esos centros de recompensa del cerebro se activan. Y sí, en tu caso, tú estudias neurociencias, pudiéramos hablar de algún proyecto. ¿Está bien?
Pedro, ¿me haces el favor de traducir eso? Aquí está acá arriba. ¿De traducir eso en inglés? Por favor.
Okay, so a short summary of this is that Maria Luisa explained that we actually worked on this, and we've actually shown using EEG that music therapy, and I'd say dance as an extension of this, actually produces changes in parts of the emotional brain that then irradiates and can stimulate neuroplasticity. So this is a very promising area. She thinks that what should be targeted is whether people are depressed or anxious, not specifically due to their sexual orientation, because they can have a sexual orientation and be perfectly fine, then they don't need therapy. So the target should be what is actually troubling them to help them, and she actually offers that if there's interest in this, there could be a joint project around this.
I love that. So we're going to continue taking questions from the audience. I'm going to go right here, and then I see your hand over there.
Hi, my name is Luis Genaro. I'm an art teacher at a local high school in the neighborhood. My question, mi pregunta es para los dos, for Maria Luisa and Dr. Valdes-Sosa. And so in the field of neuroscience, and this might not be your focus, but is there research that shows how experiencing forms of racism impacts the brain or the health of people of color?
Okay, there are two aspects to this, okay? First, any type of trauma or discrimination, be it by race or by anything, or because you're just poor, can be traumatic. In fact, we have evidence from studies, this has not been the direct thing we've studied, but we have evidence from large studies that we've done that, let's say, abuse during childhood can lead to changes in brain anatomy. And this is really troublesome because it's like a mark that's being put in early life on people's lives. But at the same time, I would say that when you have racism, it does not operate only because somebody is snubbing you or something. I mean, usually racism is embedded in economic and social differences. And all of this has an impact. We've done very serious studies in which we compared in the 80s, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, the US, and Cuba. And we looked at one of the major factors that impact on brain development. And what we found that socioeconomic status was the main thing that differentiated groups. So basically there was no differences in brain development between any of these countries if you factored out socioeconomic status. So I would say that the problem of racism, it's not been my specialty, there's been some work on this, but we think that it's one thing that can affect it, but that racism is something that is much more than just the superficial aspects. It's embedded in socioeconomic differences, in class structure, and in fact, the bad thing about this is that it lasts for several generations. In fact, one of the major efforts, Maria Luisa was a teacher in that, in Cuba has been in certain years to try to carry university education to wider and wider people, ranges of people as a protective factor. But it's not, from the studies we've done, this, I would say, these crimes that humanity's committed against itself by making these divisions. The sad thing about it is that we should be aware of it, because their effect does not disappear by just correcting certain things. It drags on through the education, the media, where you are. The people that are discriminated. They have fetal alcohol syndrome. They have more risk factors. It's very difficult to disentangle the environmental and the genetic stuff and brain development, because it's all tied together and it all affects. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, something that I told someone from the US a month ago, this was a month ago, they were visiting me, and they said, what would you like to do for the next year? And I said, the neurosciences of the disadvantaged, because we have to help them with it.
I'm Daniel Turner Lloveras. I'm a physician working with the underserved in Skid Row. Thank you. Primero quiero decir gracias por venir a nuestra universidad. Siempre es un placer escuchar sobre las investigaciones que están haciendo en Cuba. Entonces, gracias por venir. Voy a decir la pregunta en inglés, pero me avisa si es mejor si tengo que traducirlo, ¿no? So I was actually one of the lucky students here at USC about 40 years ago, not that many years, but who was able to go investigate the healthcare system of Cuba with an organization called PACE. I'm not sure if that's still here at USC. I was back in 2003, and I was blown away by the primary healthcare system there, and actually considered going to medical school there, but decided to end up studying here. But my question was, your first answer to his question, you stated that it was the free-flowing information between entities that really led to the progression of your research and innovative ideas. And I was wondering if you could tell us what has been your greatest obstacle you've had to overcome to accomplish the research that you're doing, and if the US-Cuba embargo is decreasing or making it more difficult to have the highest quality of care being delivered to patients, and also the quality of the research being able to be done in Cuba.
The biggest obstacle, I mean, there's been several obstacles. I could say the same as Provost Quick. I have a list of people, things that I mean, for example, I hate bureaucrats any side of the political line. I mean, but anyway, no, I think that a big obstacle has been precisely political divisions and ideologies. For example, we tried to get at one point the first 3 Tesla MRI system. It was going to be donated by UCLA to us. And after 2 years, we weren't able to go through with this. We've had equipment, I mean, this is undoubtedly the embargo. And this is something that now that President Obama is going to visit us, I think it's something that some pressure should be put up, because there's actually an organization, a journal called MEDIC, M-E-D-I-C-C. And it's a US journal. It's gotten into the citation list, and it's about Cuban medicine. They wrote a white paper recently, and they're asking for support before Obama visits, that the one thing that should be completely freed is the possibility of doing joint projects in the biomedical field. And we think this is perfectly possible, because this is something that has no further, and it has a clear benefit for both sides and for other countries. What I expect is that if the more, already we're feeling, I get about 1 or 2 visits a week from people from the States. And it can be students, they just call me up and I say, come over, I show them the center, and I talk about this. And already there's a flow of goodwill. People are finding, one of the biggest obstacles is ignorance. It's people that didn't know what was going on in Cuba, they didn't know the possibilities and how absurd these barriers were. And now that they're starting to learn, I think that it's very important to keep this up. This is why I'm so happy to be talking to you and have spent the day, because this will allow us to finally overcome this barrier and perhaps concentrate our energies on helping other people. So I'm pretty positive about this. I think that even before the lifting of the embargo, we're seeing the effect of this change of policy. We've always had relations with the States. U.S. science always has prestige in Cuba, and we've always tried to get the most out of this and with our friends. Now it's much easier. In the future, it's going to be much more fruitful.
Hi, my name is Diana, and I'm a junior here. And my question is, so you talked about how it's kind of like a mindset that the commoditization of like people's health, and how instead of privatizing that, you have to really have care for people and like use all your resources in order to make a better world. So I think, like in my policy classes, I always ask professors or guest speakers, like, what's it gonna take for people to push those resources and make sure change does happen, and you stop commodifying people's like education and their health. Do you think that political revolution can happen here in the United States? Or if it doesn't happen, how can us young people go into the fields of policy and enact those changes without having restrictions and barriers placed on us?
Well, I think that something that resonated to me when I visited the Chicano Center here is the fact that united action can produce effects. I have to tell you, the photograph I showed you of my parents, my mother is mulatto, okay? So I suffered when I was a kid from discrimination. In fact, when we moved to that last house I showed you, there was some talk, how come these colored people are coming into the neighborhood? There's a totally different situation now. I'm not saying no society is perfect, there's been advance. And how was that advance achieved? It was through the struggle of Afro-Americans. The changes are affected by people actually not giving up and continuing talking about things. And I think that these issues, there's a big ideological barrier in the US where some things people just get scared of. I mean, for me, it's been a tremendous disappointment to see Obamacare not really fulfilled as it should be. I'm sorry I'm talking about US politics, but you asked me. Because I think that I'm not meddling again with anybody. Maybe plastic surgery should be just, it depends on paying, whatever, but saving a child's life with cancer cannot depend on how much you can spend. Now, in certain ways, the US has this set up. In certain ways, the US has set it up, but I think that we have to talk about this. It has to be depoliticized, de-ideologized. When people talk about taking care of other people, they shouldn't be like they want to bring the USSR back here. No, these are elemental rights, and I think that they have to, I think it's by joint effort and talking and fighting, actually, more than talking, for what things that need to be done.
Right.
Yes, go ahead.
Since you ventured into the political realm a little bit.
My mistake.
That's nice.
So let me ask about Cuban politics for just 1 second. So, Cuba's been in a process of change almost continuously. I mean, it's only monolithic from the outside, but certainly the last 25 years, there have been a lot of changes in the last few years. And now more to come. I mean, we know for sure there's certain biological certainties that are going to bring about further change in Cuba. Tell me about your concerns about the preservation of the ideals you've just spoken about, particularly in the healthcare system. I mean, in Cuba now, the refrain is to preserve the logos of the revolution, and first and foremost of those is the public health system, which was created in a political environment that doesn't exist anymore, and it is now in a process of further change. I'm interested in your feelings about the challenges of maintaining those ideals and more than the ideals, the practical policies at a time we don't know what Cuba's going to look like even in a few years.
You're absolutely right about that. There's no guarantee of anything in any place. That's why we have to be vigilant, and we actually have to show by example and continuing our work that certain things can be continued and be possible. My hope, and I'm just expressing a hope, is that we will be able to loosen up many of the things that were copied from other places, excessive centralization, a touch of bureaucracy, and we'll be able to, let's say, liberalize, and that's started at a pace that I'm not satisfied, but that's started. At the same time, I wouldn't agree at all, and I think the majority of the people would agree with me, that throwing away what we've achieved in education and in health. Education is the other human right that many people don't mention, but it is a human right. So there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee, but that's why we have to have eternal vigilance and just struggle to keep what we need to keep.
My name is Aralia. I'm working on my dissertation, and my topic is the effects of poverty on mental health. However, I was told it's not a big enough problem. So, and I'm here at USC. My question is, how is it that you were able to overcome the political and financial barriers in order to achieve the greater good of helping society?
Well, I mean, this was a policy of the society. Okay, this is not something that's just a group of individuals. It was, let's say, the world view of the society, and it has received everything we've done has received support at all levels of the population. And whatever funds that have been available have been put there, sometimes more, sometimes less. It is a big challenge, okay? But it's something that we had the advantage that we didn't have a huge medical system. So when it was built up, the medical system, the educational system, it started from scratch with these ideas. And I sincerely hope that they're sufficiently, let's say, entrenched. I'm gonna have to put Cuban coffee here.
I will say this, just because we're giving gifts, and hopefully they enjoy them. I did receive 2 Cuban cigars from them today. My boss didn't hear that. She's got some hearing problems going on later this evening. So the exchange is happening. We also wanted to thank Professor Roberto Suro, so please give him a round of applause, y'all. So last but not least, I wanted to say a few things. So it's been a really incredible day, to be honest with you. I'm so glad that they came here. I'm so glad that we started the day with Provost Quick and had that conversation. He was very extremely open to possibilities, which was great. Some things that we discussed, and I'd love to see a raise of hands here, is the opportunity of taking students to Cuba. Who would like that? Right? Exactly. And so that includes science. We were talking about science. Jack and his great partners there were talking about the science students. I was talking about all the rest of the students, and we were like, hey, maybe we should come together. So I think that's a real interesting possibility. But this is just the beginning, obviously, of this conversation, so we look forward to continuing it. And I'm going to let you know in a second where to go, but I did want to mention one more thing. I wanted to thank Tim Conley and Dean Varun Soni, who is recording this, so can you guys give them a round of applause? I wanted to thank all of you for coming out. If you look across the room, we really do have a really great diversity. And again, I owe that to the co-sponsors and all the great team effort. So thank you very much. Thank you to the students. Thank you to the alumni. Thank you to the parents I see in the audience. Thank you to faculty, staff, friends, and also my family who's in the house. So thank you, Madrina, Padrino. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Sister. It's a family affair. And now we've come to part 3 of tonight. So if anybody is still hungry, we'd love to invite you to Ballroom B at Ronald Tudor Center, and we have an awesome closing reception with lots of food from Porto's Cuban Bakery. Yeah, which is ranked #1 in the country on Yelp. That's for you, Portos. By the way, it's a video, so I'll send it to Vitres Potros later. I'll be like, I just promoted you. Can we get free stuff now? Cool. And then also, I want to thank the Latino Business Student Association for sponsoring the reception later this evening. And we're going to have live Cuban music by Changi Majadero. So, yes, give it up to LBSA and give it up to that group. So we hope that you've had a wonderful evening. We ask you to head over now to Ronald Tudor Center for that reception. All the folks here will be over there. You can talk to them. And one last thing, give a huge round of applause if you want the Latino Last Lecture Series Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, Part 5. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Mil gracias. Que les vaya muy bien. Buenas noches. And fight on.